Question 3. Mrs. Luxton loves playing football with Mrs. Edge. Mrs. Luxton has scored 4 more goals than Mrs. Edge. Together they have scored 16 goals. A. How many goals did Mrs. Edge score? And B. How many goals did Mrs. Luxton score? Question 3. The first thing we need to find out is who scored the least amount or the fewest amount of goals. So if you look at the question, Mrs. Luxton has scored 4 more than Mrs. Edge. So Mrs. Edge has scored the fewest, as Mrs. Luxton has scored 4 more. So the first thing we're going to do is to create 2 labels, the first label being Mrs. Edge and the second label being Mrs. Luxton. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a block to represent Mrs. Edge, who is the smallest amount. And then for Mrs. Luxton, we're going to create a block the same as Mrs. Edge, but we're going to create an additional block representing 4 more, because Mrs. Luxton has 4 more than Mrs. Edge. And I'm going to put 4 in that box. Now together they have scored 16 goals. Now in the bar model, we like to have equal blocks. So we want to be left with just these 2 equal blocks. So we need to get rid of this little 4. So I'm just going to take that 4 away. So now we have 16 minus 4 gives us 12. So now I'm going to say 2 blocks are equal to 12. We've taken the 4 away, so 16 take 4 is 12. So 1 block is equal to 12 over 2, which gives us 6. So 1 block is equal to 6, and we can put those back in the blocks, 6 and 6. We can now answer the question. A. How many goals has Mrs. Edge scored? And we can see from the diagram she scored 6. And B. How many goals has Mrs. Luxton scored? Well, she has scored 6 plus 4, which is 10. We have solved the word problem. Question 3, using the algebraic method. The first thing we need to look for is to see who has the least amount of goals. We can see that Mrs. Luxton has 4 more goals than Mrs. Edge, so Mrs. Edge has the least amount of goals. So let's now look at our steps. Step 1. Name only one variable, which is x, and it is usually the smallest quantity. So the smallest quantity is Mrs. Edge. So step 1. Mrs. Edge is equal to x. She is the smallest quantity. So step 2. Define the other unknowns in terms of x. The other unknowns are Mrs. Luxton. We don't know how many goals Mrs. Luxton has scored. So we've got to define Mrs. Luxton. We've got to create an algebraic expression for Mrs. Luxton. So step 2. Mrs. Luxton. Now, Mrs. Luxton, here's Mrs. Luxton, has 4 more goals than Mrs. Edge. So she will be Mrs. Edge's amount, which is x, plus 4. 4 more means plus 4. So we now have an expression for Mrs. Luxton. So now let's look at step 3. Create an equation and solve it. Find the value of x. So step 3, we now need to create an equation. 3. Well, let's say it in words first. Mrs. E, or Mrs. Edge, plus Mrs. Luxton between them have scored 16 goals. So now we're going to write that in algebraic terms. Mrs. Edge is x, add Mrs. Luxton, and her expression is x plus 4. X plus 4 equals 16. So we've put the expressions into an equation. We need to simplify this equation a little better. So let's add together the like terms. So x plus x gives us 2x. Plus 4 equals 16. Now let's look at this equation. We want to get x on its own. So we need to get rid of this plus 4. In order to undo the plus 4, we need to take it away to make it 0. So we need to take away 4 from this side and 4 from this side. So we're going to take 4 away from the left hand side and 4 away from the right hand side. Remember, what you do to one side you must do to the other. And just draw a line and a line. So we've got 2x, and this is where square paper really helps. You've got plus 4, take 4, it leaves nothing. 16, take 4, is 12. So we know that 2x, if we look carefully, 2x equals 12. Now we want to get x on its own. So I'm just going to write down the equation again. 2x is equal to 12, just so it's a little bit more clearer. 2x is equal to 12. We need to get the x on its own. Remember, the 2 is multiplied by x. 2x is 2 times x. To undo the multiplication, we have to divide. So we're going to divide by 2. And what we do to one side of the equation, we do to the other. We divide the right-hand side by 2. So 2 goes into 2 once. 2 goes into 2 once. 1 over 1 is 1. Any number over 1 is the number itself. So we've got 1x. Well, we don't write the 1 in front of the x. Equals 2 goes into 2 once. 2 goes into 12 6 times. So we can say that it's 6. So x is equal to 6. It's always a good idea to highlight the answer to the equation. So step 4, we're now going to substitute the x is equal to 6 back into the equations and expressions to answer the question. So let's have a look at A, part A of the question. How many goals did Mrs. Edge score, first of all? So we can see that Mrs. Edge scored x. That's the expression for Mrs. X. That's the original expression. So x is equal to 6. So we can say Mrs. Edge her expression was x, and we know that x is equal to 6, so Mrs. Edge scored 6 goals. And highlight her answer. Now Mrs. Luxton let's look at her expression. We'll write it down again. Mrs. Luxton was x plus 4. Mrs. Luxton was x plus 4. So x is 6. Add 4 equals 10. So Mrs. Luxton scored 10 goals. We have now solved a word problem using the algebraic method.